My name is Serafina Sterling. I am 34 years old. On the morning of my younger brother's $4 million wedding, I secured a diamond lapel pin to my tailored charcoal blazer, slid behind the wheel of my matte black Aston Martin, and drove toward the Kensington coastal estate, with a ghost sitting quietly in my passenger seat. I will tell you his name eventually. First, you need to understand that I was not supposed to be within 50 miles of that estate. Exactly 3 weeks earlier, my brother's fiancée had called me her, voice dripping with the kind of weaponized sweetness exclusive to the newly wealthy, to inform me that I was no longer welcome at my own brother's wedding. I thanked her for the update. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry in my line of work. You learn very quickly that people who aggressively slam a door in your face almost always forget to check if you own the building. By the time the tires of my car hit the crushed white gravel of the Kensington driveway, I knew exactly how I was going to dismantle her entirely. Welcome back to Alpha and Power Stories. If you have ever been entirely underestimated by a narcissist, only to watch their carefully constructed empire collapse the moment you decided to stop playing nice, leave a comment below and hit subscribe. You are going to want to hear exactly how this execution was carried out. To understand the magnitude of the mistake they made, you have to understand who I am. My brother, Julian, is 28. He is a brilliant, fundamentally kind-hearted software architect who recently sold his first tech startup for a staggering sum. Julian is a genius with code, but he is hopelessly, dangerously naive when it comes to human predators. I, on the other hand, am not. I am a senior managing partner at Vanguard Crisis Group, a highly classified boutique crisis management firm operating out of Washington, D.C. and New York. I do not plan events, I do not manage public relations, I am the woman billionaires, politicians, and global CEOs call at 3 in the morning when a catastrophic scandal is about to destroy their lives. I bury corporate espionage, I negotiate with hostile entities, and I legally annihilate anyone who threatens my clients. I deal in leverage, NDAs, and absolute icy destruction. Because of the extreme confidentiality of my work, I do not talk about it. To Julian's new in-laws, the Kensingtons, I was simply Julian's older sister, a single woman living in an apartment in the city, working some vague consulting job that clearly did not yield the kind of generational wealth they respected. Julian brought Sloane Kensington home for the first time on a brisk Tuesday in November, 2 years ago. Sloane was 27, aggressively polished and curated to within an inch of her life. Her hair was a flawless, icy blonde, her clothes were quiet luxury, devoid of logos but astronomically expensive. She spoke in the hushed, breathless cadence of someone who expects every word she says to be recorded for a documentary. "Serafina, your apartment is so quaint," Sloane had said during that first dinner, her eyes scanning my minimalist penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline. She didn't recognize the original Rothko on the wall or the custom Italian furniture. She only saw a lack of overt, gaudy display. "Julian told me you do freelance consulting. That must be so flexible for you." "It has its moments," I replied smoothly, pouring her a glass of vintage Bordeaux that cost more than her entire outfit. I watched the way she looked at Julian. It wasn't love, it was an appraisal. She looked at him the way a real estate developer looks at a prime, undeveloped lot. Julian, blinded by her practiced charm and undeniable beauty, saw none of it. He looked lighter, happier than he had in years since our parents passed away. Because I loved him, I ignored the cold, professional alarm bells ringing in the back of my mind. I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. That was my first mistake. 8 months later, Julian proposed. He bought a breathtaking, custom-cut diamond ring, and Sloane immediately shifted into wedding production mode. That is when I met her mother, Eleanor Kensington. Eleanor was a prominent real estate mogul in the Hamptons, a woman whose entire personality was built around establishing dominance in any room she entered. She wore severe designer suits, possessed a smile that looked like a threat, and viewed Julian not as a son-in-law, but as an acquisition. We met officially at an engagement dinner hosted at the Kensington's sprawling country club. I wore a simple, tailored black dress. Eleanor wore a dress that aggressively announced her tax bracket. Serafina, Eleanor said, shaking my hand with a firm masculine grip. Julian has told us so little about you. He mentioned you consult. Human resources, was it? Crisis management, I corrected mildly. Eleanor let out a short, dismissive laugh. Oh, how interesting. Well, Julian is in the big leagues now. The Kensington network will be quite an adjustment for him, but we'll polish him up. We are hosting the wedding at our coastal estate, of course. 400 guests, a proper society event. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my lack of visible diamonds. Don't worry about contributing to the wedding budget, dear. We know this level of event is far beyond your scope. Just focus on finding a nice dress. We have an aesthetic to maintain, and Sloane is very particular about the visual narrative of the day. The visual narrative, I smiled, a small, polite expression that did not reach my eyes. I appreciate the guidance, sir. I am sure the visual narrative will be unforgettable. I didn't argue with her, I didn't correct her assumption about my net worth. In my profession, you never interrupt a target while they are underestimating you. It is the greatest tactical advantage you can possess. The exclusion began slowly, a masterclass in passive-aggressive marginalization. First, I was left off the primary wedding planning group chats. When Julian asked Sloane about it, she brushed it off as a simple iCloud glitch. Oh, Julian, the planner is just keeping the thread strictly to the design team. Serafina doesn't need to be bothered with floral arrangements. We want her to just relax. Then came the bridal shower. I found out about it 3 days after it happened, scrolling through a highly curated social media album. There were 50 women in attendance, drinking champagne on a yacht chartered out of Montauk. I had not received an invitation. When I gently mentioned it to Julian, he looked confused, then deeply apologetic. Sloane said, "She mailed your invitation weeks ago, Sarah. She thought you were just too busy with work to come. She was actually really hurt that you didn't RSVP." I looked at my brother, watching the lie take root in his mind. Sloane had not mailed an invitation. She had deliberately excluded me, and then preemptively spun the narrative to make herself the victim of my supposed neglect. It was a classic textbook manipulation tactic. I didn't defend myself, I simply nodded. My mistake, Julian. I must have missed it in the mail. I went back to my home office, locked the door, and opened a secure encrypted file on my server. I titled it Kensington. I did not know what I was looking for yet, but I knew I was no longer dealing with a difficult sister-in-law. I was dealing with a hostile entity trying to isolate my only family member. By September, 2 months before the wedding, the exclusion escalated from passive to overt. The preliminary seating chart and photography list were emailed to the fam by Sloane's luxury wedding planner. I opened the PDF over my morning espresso. Under the family portraits, pre-ceremony section, Julian's name appeared 12 times, posed with every conceivable combination of Kensington relatives. Eleanor's name was listed 7 times. My name was absent. I scrolled down to the reception seating chart. The Kensingtons were seated at massive, floral-draped head tables flanking the bride and groom. Julian's few extended relatives were placed respectfully nearby. I found my name on page 4. I was seated at table 41, the furthest table in the room, located directly next to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. I was seated with the wedding planner's assistants and the videography crew. It was not an oversight, it was a carefully calculated insult. It was Eleanor and Sloane's way of publicly establishing the hierarchy, of demonstrating to their society friends that Julian's sister was an irrelevant, lower-class footnote. I did not call Julian. I did not want to put him in a position where he had to choose between his furious sister and his crying fiancé. I understood that confronting Sloane would only yield tears, denial, and a fresh wave of manipulation aimed at Julian. Instead, I attended the engagement gala hosted by Eleanor 3 weeks later. I arrived precisely on time, wearing a bespoke midnight blue Alexander McQueen gown that was entirely unbranded but instantly recognizable to anyone who actually understood fashion. Eleanor and Sloane were holding court near the ice sculpture, surrounded by Hampton's elite. When Eleanor saw me, her eyes narrowed. She had expected me to show up in a cheap department store dress. She recovered quickly, offering a tight, venomous smile. "Serafina," Eleanor said loudly, ensuring the small crowd around her could hear. "You made it. I was worried table 41 wouldn't be comfortable for you, but Sloane insisted you prefer to be out of the spotlight." "I find the spotlight is usually reserved for those who need validation, Eleanor," I replied smoothly, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "I am perfectly comfortable observing from the perimeter. You learn so much more about a room when no one thinks you are watching." Sloane's smile faltered. For a fraction of a second, the polished facade cracked, and she looked at me with genuine uncertainty. She couldn't read me. I wasn't angry, I wasn't intimidated, and I wasn't playing by her rules. Later that evening, the inevitable confrontation occurred. I was standing on the terrace, looking out over the manicured lawns, when my phone vibrated. It was a text from Julian. He had just seen the final photography schedule and realized I had been completely omitted. He was furious and was currently looking for Sloane to demand an explanation. Before I could reply and tell him to drop it, Sloane stepped out onto the terrace. She closed the glass doors behind her, ensuring we were alone. The breathless, sweet persona vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, hard arrogance. "Julian is upset about the photos," Sloane said, her voice sharp, brittle. "I need you to tell him you requested to be left out." I turned slowly to face her, taking a sip of my champagne. "Why would I tell him a lie, Sloane?" "Because you don't fit the visual narrative of this wedding, Serafina," she spat, abandoning all pretense. "This is a society event. This is the launch of Julian's new life. My mother and I have spent months curating a specific aesthetic. You are a distraction. You make people uncomfortable with your weird, intense silence. And frankly, you don't belong in these circles. Julian is a Kensington now." I looked at her. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I simply observed her the way a scientist observes a volatile chemical reaction. "Julian is a Sterling," I corrected softly, "and you would do well to remember that. I am his future." Sloane sneered, stepping closer. "And as of right now, you are uninvited from this wedding. I will not have you ruining my aesthetic. I will tell Julian you had a work emergency and couldn't make it. If you try to show up, security will remove you." She glared at me, waiting for the explosion. She was waiting for me to scream, to cry, to threaten her. She needed me to become unhinged so she could play the victim to Julian. I gave her nothing. I held her gaze for 3 long, suffocating seconds. Then I smiled. It was a slow, chilling smile that had caused Fortune 500 CEOs to break out in a cold sweat. "I understand completely, Sloane," I said quietly. "A clean break is always best. I won't be in your wedding photos. You have my word." I walked past her, re-entered the ballroom, and left the gala without another word. When I reached my Aston Martin, I didn't drive home. I drove straight to Vanguard Crisis Group headquarters. I swiped my biometric clearance badge, walked into my corner office, and locked the door. Sloane Kensington thought she had just successfully eliminated a nuisance. She had no idea she had just declared war on a woman who dismantles global corporations for sport. I sat down at my terminal, cracked my knuckles, and opened the Kensington file. It was time to find out exactly what kind of foundation this visual narrative was built on. The first rule of crisis management is that everyone has a vulnerability. The second rule is that the louder a person broadcasts their perfection, the darker the secrets they are attempting to conceal. Sloane and Eleanor Kensington broadcasted their perfection at maximum volume. I sat in the glow of my multi-monitor setup, the city of Washington, D.C. sleeping 80 floors below me. I bypassed the standard background checks. Those are for amateurs and private investigators look for unpaid parking tickets. I engaged the Vanguard proprietary intelligence algorithms, systems designed to trace offshore shell companies, scrubbed arrest records, and deep web digital footprints. I started with the Kensington Family Trust. Eleanor projected the image of a billionaire real estate magnate, but within 2 hours of forensic financial digging, the projection collapsed. The Kensington fortune was entirely leveraged. Eleanor had survived the 2008 financial crisis by taking on massive, predatory mezzanine debt. She was drowning in it. The coastal estate, the Hampton properties, the Manhattan penthouse, they were all heavily mortgaged. Eleanor wasn't looking for a son-in-law, she was looking for a bailout. Julian's recent startup acquisition had made him liquid to the tune of 9 figures. He was the perfect, naive mark to infuse cash into their collapsing empire. That explained Eleanor, but I wasn't finished. I pivoted my search to Sloan. Sloan's official biography was flawless. A pristine degree from an Ivy League university, a successful stint at an art auction house, and a spotless social record. It was too clean. I dug deeper, running a cross-reference on her social security number through a shadow database of sealed state records. At 4 a.m., the algorithm flagged an anomaly in Clark County, Nevada. I opened the file. It was a marriage certificate. 5 years ago, a 22-year-old Sloane Kensington had legally married a man named Caleb Vance. I paused, sipping my espresso, the caffeine and adrenaline sharpening my focus into a razor edge. People get married in Vegas. People make mistakes in their early 20s. It wasn't inherently scandalous. But when I ran a search for the corresponding divorce decree or annulment filing across all 50 states, the database returned a null result. There was no divorce. Sloane Kensington was still legally married. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The implications were staggering. In 3 weeks, Julian was going to stand in front of 400 people and marry a woman who was already legally bound to another man. Bigamy voids a marriage instantly. It meant Julian's massive tech fortune, which Sloane had aggressively insisted on merging into a joint account without a prenuptial agreement, would remain entirely his. Unless, of course, she managed to drain it before the fraud was discovered. But why? Why stay married? Why not simply file the paperwork and sever the tie quietly? I opened a new terminal and ran a comprehensive background check on Caleb Vance. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. 5 years ago, Caleb Vance was a rising star in the decentralized finance sector. He ran a boutique cryptocurrencies exchange out of Miami. Sloane was listed as his chief operating officer. 4 years ago, the SEC and the FBI raided the exchange. They discovered a massive Ponzi structure, embezzled client funds, and wire fraud totaling nearly $40 million. Caleb Vance took the fall. He pleaded guilty, serving 3 years in a federal minimum security prison. He was released on parole 14 months ago. Sloane was never indicted. She was never even publicly named in the filings. The marriage was not an accident. It was a legal shield. Under federal law, a spouse cannot be compelled to testify against their partner in a criminal proceeding. By staying legally married, Sloane ensured Caleb could not be pressured to flip on her. Furthermore, remaining married prevented a messy, highly scrutinized divorce proceeding that would have exposed their hidden, offshore assets to the federal courts. She had let him go to prison, kept the remaining hidden capital, and reinvented herself in the Hamptons as a flawless society heiress. I stared at the screen, a cold, absolute fury crystallizing in my chest. Sloane had not just excluded me from a photography list. She was actively orchestrating a massive financial and emotional fraud against my only brother. I picked up my phone and called my lead field operative. I need the current physical location of a Caleb Vance. Released on federal per 14 months ago, out of Miami. Find him by noon. They found him in 4 hours. Caleb Vance was living in a modest, dilapidated apartment complex in working-class Boston, working as a junior mechanic in an auto repair shop. The federal government had seized every dime he possessed. He was a ghost, trying to rebuild a life from the ashes of a felony conviction. I flew to Boston the next morning. I did not call ahead. I do not believe in giving targets time to prepare a narrative. I arrived at the auto repair shop in a tailored suit, looking entirely out of place among the grease, hydraulic lifts and scent of motor oil. I found Caleb working under the chassis of a rusted sedan. He was 31, his hands stained black with grease, his face tired and weathered far beyond his years. "Caleb Vance," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the garage. He slid out from under the car, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at me, instantly recognizing the aura of authority. He looked like a man who assumed I was federal law enforcement, arriving to revoke his parole. If this is about the restitution payments, I sent the check on Tuesday, Caleb said, his voice flat, exhausted. I am not with the Department of Justice, Caleb. I am in the private sector, I replied, handing him my embossed business card. My name is Serafina Sterling. My brother Julian is scheduled to marry your legal wife in exactly 2 weeks. Caleb froze. The rag slipped from his hands, hitting the concrete floor. Sloane is getting married, he whispered, the shock genuine. She is attempting to, I corrected, to a very wealthy, very naive young man. She assumes your marriage is safely buried under your felony conviction. She assumes you are too broken and too intimidated by her mother's lawyers to ever surface again. Caleb let out a bitter, hollow laugh. She told me she filed the annulment papers years ago. She said her mother's lawyers handled it. They didn't. I said simply, you are still her husband, which means any marriage she enters into is legally void. Bigamy is a felony, Caleb. And if she goes through with this, and the federal government discovers you are still legally bound to her while she commits another massive financial fraud, your parole will be revoked. You will go back to prison as an accessory. The color drained from his face. The reality of his legal exposure hit him like a physical blow. I haven't spoken to her in 4 years. I took the fall for that exchange. She walked away with the offshore accounts, and I walked into a federal cell. I don't want anything to do with her. I am not asking you to reconcile, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, projecting the calm, authoritative reassurance I use in high-stakes negotiations. I am asking you to finish it. She let you take the fall. She ruined your life while she reinvented hers. And now, she is trying to ruin my brother's. I stepped closer to him. I want you to come with me to the wedding. Caleb, I want you to stand next to me when she tries to walk down the aisle. I want you to look her in the eye and watch her entire counterfeit empire burn to the ground. Vanguard Crisis Group will handle your legal fees. We will ensure your parole is protected. But I need you in the room. Caleb looked down at his grease-stained hands. He thought about the 3 years he spent in a concrete cell. He thought about the millions she stole, and the audacity of her attempting to do it again to someone else. He looked back up at me. His eyes were no longer exhausted. They were hard, cold, and resolved. When do we leave? He asked. The exclusion continued to mount as the wedding day approached. Sloane, operating under the assumption that I had meekly accepted my fate at the engagement gala, doubled down on her strategy to erase me completely. She scheduled the wedding rehearsal dinner at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Manhattan. Julian assumed I was invited. Sloane, however, had personally intercepted the invitation list. I received a phone call from Julian the night before the dinner. He sounded stressed, torn between his loyalty to me and the overwhelming pressure of the Kensington machine. Sarah, I'm so sorry, Julian said, his voice tight. Sloane told me the venue has a strict capacity limit. She said she tried to fit you in, but it's just the bridal party and the immediate sponsors. I told her I'd pay for a larger room, but she said the aesthetic was already set. Julian, it's fine, I lied smoothly. I have a major crisis account I need to manage anyway. Do not fight with her over this. Enjoy your rehearsal, are you sure? I feel like you're being pushed out, Sarah. Ever since the engagement, she gets so defensive whenever I bring you up. I am perfectly fine, Julian. I will see you at the wedding, I promised, and I meant it. I did not spend the night of the rehearsal dinner crying in my apartment. I spent it finalizing the logistical execution of Sloane's destruction. I drafted a comprehensive encrypted dossier containing the marriage certificate, the SEC raid reports, the offshore account routing numbers, and Eleanor's catastrophic debt profiles. I programmed the Vanguard servers to mass email the dossier to every single Kensington investor, every society reporter, and Julian's personal attorney at exactly 5 p.m. on the day of the wedding, the exact moment Sloane was scheduled to walk down the aisle. I was not just going to stop a wedding, I was going to surgically remove the Kensington family from high society. The morning of the wedding arrived with a crisp, clear ocean breeze. I woke at dawn. I did not feel nervous. I felt the profound, chilling calm that always precedes a successful operation. I dressed meticulously. I did not wear the bridesmaid dress I had originally ordered before the exclusion began. I wore a tailored, charcoal gray Alexander McQueen suit. It was the armor of a corporate executioner. I secured a vintage diamond lapel pin apiece that had belonged to my mother to the collar. It was the only sentimental thing I allowed myself to carry. I picked Caleb Vance up at a discreet hotel I had arranged for him near the coastal estate. He was wearing a dark, well-tailored suit I had procured for him. He looked sharp, clean, and entirely unrecognizable from the grease-stained mechanic I had met in Boston. He looked like the formidable tech executive he had once been, before Sloane Kensington destroyed him. He got into the passenger seat of the Aston Martin. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The shared understanding of absolute retaliation required no small talk. We drove toward the Kensington coastal estate. The property was heavily guarded. Eleanor had hired a private security firm to manage the gate. They had a guest list on an iPad, checking the names of the arriving society elite. I pulled the Aston Martin up to the security checkpoint. The guard, a large man with an earpiece, leaned down to my window. "Name, please?" he asked. "Serafina Sterlings," I said, my voice carrying the unquestionable authority of someone who owns the ground they stand on. "Sister of the groom." The guard checked his iPad. He frowned. "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling. Your name was flagged this morning by the bride's mother. You've been removed from the approved entry list." I looked at him. I didn't argue. I reached into the center console and produced a heavy, embossed document. It was a federal injunction I had secured through a Vanguard contact, prohibiting the restriction of my movement on the premises under the guise of an active federal asset investigation. It was highly irregular, legally terrifying, and completely effective against private security guards who do not want to be indicted for obstruction. I handed it to him. He read the first paragraph, saw the federal seals, and paled. "Open the gate," I commanded softly. He opened the gate. I drove up the winding, immaculate driveway, parking the Aston Martin near the massive oak doors of the main estate. The ceremony was taking place on the sprawling lawn overlooking the ocean. The string quartet was already playing. 400 guests, draped in couture, were taking their seats. Caleb and I stepped out of the car. We walked toward the grand entrance. Sloane was standing just inside the massive glass doors of the foyer, surrounded by her bridesmaids, waiting for her cue to begin the procession. She looked radiant, encased in a custom Vera Wang gown, clutching a bouquet of white peonies. Then she saw me. Through the glass, across 50 feet of marble and manicured lawn, our eyes locked. The radiant, breathless bride vanished, her face contorted into an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. She abandoned her bridesmaids. She dropped her bouquet. She grabbed the heavy skirts of her gown and sprinted toward the doors, desperate to physically block me from entering the venue. She threw the doors open just as I reached the threshold. "What are you doing here?" Sloane screamed, her voice cracking, entirely abandoning the hushed, curated tone she had spent 2 years perfecting. Guests in the back rows turned around, startled by the outburst. The string quartet faltered for a fraction of a second. "You were uninvited, Serafina. Get out, security." She was hyperventilating, her perfectly manicured hands shaking as she tried to physically block the doorway. "You do not belong here. You are ruining my aesthetic." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her hysteria. I looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a predator observing cornered prey. "I am not here to ruin your aesthetic, Sloane," I said quietly, the words carrying the weight of an anvil. "I am here to inform you that your visual narrative has a fatal legal flaw." "Get out!" she shrieked again, tears of genuine rage threatening to spill over her flawless makeup. "You are just a jealous, bitter consultant. You have nothing. Julian is mine." I smiled. It was the same chilling smile I had given her on the terrace 3 weeks ago. "Julian is a Sterling," I said. my voice echoing in the sudden silence of the entryway. And you are a Vance. I stepped sideways. Caleb walked out from behind me, stepping into the sunlight. The transformation in Sloane Kensington was absolute and terrifying. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her a ghastly, translucent white. Her eyes widened to the point of tearing. The screaming stopped instantly, replaced by a soundless, suffocating gasp. "Hello, Sloane," Caleb said. His voice was steady, devoid of anger, entirely empty of the love he had once held for her. It was the voice of a ghost demanding a reckoning. "You forgot to file the paperwork." Sloane Kensington physically recoiled, as if the air around her had suddenly turned toxic. She stumbled backward, the heel of her designer stiletto catching on the marble floor. If one of her bridesmaids hadn't instinctively grabbed her arm, she would have collapsed entirely. The silence that fell over the grand entryway was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs in the fraction of a second after a bomb detonates, just before the shockwave hits. The guests in the back rows of the lawn ceremony had stopped pretending not to watch. The string quartet had ceased playing entirely. The visual narrative of the flawless $4 million society wedding was actively disintegrating, replaced by raw, unscripted horror. "Caleb," Sloane whispered, the word barely escaping her throat. She looked at him as if he had clawed his way out of a grave. "How? Why are you?" She couldn't form a coherent sentence. The meticulously constructed lie she had lived for 4 years was imploding in real time, confronted by the physical reality of the man she had sacrificed to build it. Before Caleb could respond, Eleanor Kensington stormed through the foyer. Eleanor was a force of nature, a woman accustomed to bending reality to her will through sheer volume and intimidation. She wore a severe, structured gown that looked more like armor than wedding attire. She saw me standing in the doorway, and her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage. "What is the meaning of this?" Eleanor barked, her voice booming across the marble. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Security. I gave express orders that this woman was not to be permitted on the grounds. Remove her immediately." 2 large men in dark suits stepped forward from the shadows of the foyer, reaching for my arms. "I wouldn't touch her," Caleb said. His voice was low, but it carried an edge of danger that stopped the guards in their tracks. He stepped slightly in front of me, placing himself between me and Eleanor's security detail. Eleanor finally registered Caleb's presence. Her eyes widened, scanning his tailored suit, recognizing him instantly despite the 4 years and the prison sentence. "You," Eleanor hissed, her upper lip curling in disgust. "You pathetic little convict, how dare you show your face here? You have no right to step foot on this property." "He has every right, Eleanor," I said, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room like a scalpel. "He is, after all, the bride's husband." The gasp that rippled through the assembled bridesmaids was audible. One of them actually dropped her champagne flute. "That is a lie," Eleanor roared, stepping in front of Sloane, as if to physically shield her from the truth. "That is a desperate, pathetic lie fabricated by a jealous sister. Sloane annulled that mistake years ago. He is nothing but a disgruntled criminal trying to extort us on the biggest day of our lives." She turned to the security guards. "Get them out of here now, Eleanor," I said, my voice dropping in volume, forcing everyone in the foyer to lean in to hear me. It is a classic interrogation tactic. The quieter you speak, the more authority you command. If your security guards lay a hand on me or Mr. Vance, I will have them arrested for federal obstruction. And then I will have you arrested for conspiracy to commit bigamy." Eleanor froze, the word federal hung in the air, heavy and lethal. "You are delusional," Eleanor spat, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of genuine uncertainty. She had assumed I was a low-level consultant. She had no framework for a woman who casually threatened federal indictments at a wedding. I reached into the interior pocket of my charcoal blazer and withdrew a sleek, black leather folder. I opened it and held up a certified document bearing the official seal of Clark County, Nevada. "This," I announced, projecting my voice so that the first few rows of guests on the lawn could hear clearly, is a certified copy of a marriage license issued to Caleb Vance and Sloane Kensington 5 years ago. I flipped to the next page. And this, I continued, is an official affidavit from the state of Nevada, confirming that no divorce decree, annulment, or dissolution of marriage has ever been filed by either party. Your daughter is legally married, Eleanor, and any vows she attempts to take today are not only void, they constitute a felony. Sloane let out a ragged sob, covering her face with her hands. The pristine Vera Wang gown suddenly looked absurd, a costume for a play that had just been cancelled. Sloane, tell them it's a lie, Eleanor demanded, turning to her daughter, shaking her by the shoulder. Tell them the lawyers handled it. Sloane couldn't speak, she just shook her head, tears ruining her flawless makeup, the icy blonde facade entirely shattered. The lawyers didn't handle it, Eleanor, Caleb said, his voice hard and uncompromising. She told me not to file the paperwork, she said it would trigger an asset review by the SEC. She stayed married to me so she wouldn't have to testify. And so, she could hide the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands while I went to federal prison. The mention of the SEC and offshore accounts sent a shockwave through the foyer. The Kensingtons were deeply embedded in high society. High society does not tolerate financial scandal, especially when it involves prison time. At that exact moment, the heavy oak doors at the end of the aisle opened, and Julian walked out. My brother looked devastatingly handsome in his custom tuxedo, but his face was etched with confusion and concern. He had been waiting at the altar, he had heard the shouting, he had walked down the aisle, parting the sea of bewildered guests, to find out why his bride was screaming at his sister. Sarah? Julian asked, stepping into the foyer, his eyes darting between me, the sobbing Sloane, the furious Eleanor, and the stranger standing by my side. What is going on? Why is security here? Sloane lunged toward him. She grabbed his tuxedo jacket, her knuckles white, her face stained with tears and mascara. Julian, please, Sloane begged, her voice high and desperate. It's a lie, your sister is trying to ruin us. She hired this man to come here and tell horrible lies, because she's jealous. She's trying to destroy our wedding. Julian looked at her, then looked at me. He was naive, but he was not stupid. He knew me, he knew I did not manufacture drama. He knew that if I was standing in this foyer, dressed like a corporate executioner, something catastrophic had occurred. Sarah, Julian said quietly, gently prying Sloane's hands off his lapel. What is she talking about? I looked at my brother. My heart ached for him. I knew the truth was going to break his heart, but a broken heart heals. A marriage built on massive financial fraud and bigamy destroys you permanently. Julian, I said softly, stepping toward him, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The woman you are about to marry is hiding a past that will legally and financially annihilate you. I gestured to Caleb. This is Caleb Vance, he is a former cryptocurrency executive. I paused, ensuring Julian was absorbing every word. He is also Sloane's legal husband. Julian stared at Caleb, the color drained from Julian's face, leaving him looking hollow, as if the air had been pulled from his lungs. Husband? He repeated, the word sounding foreign, incomprehensible. It was an annulled mistake. Eleanor shrieked, stepping forward again, desperate to salvage the acquisition of Julian's wealth. They were children. Julian, darling, do not listen to this bitter woman. She is trying to sabotage your happiness because she has none of her own. It was not an annulled mistake, Julian, Caleb interjected. He looked at my brother with a strange mixture of pity and solidarity. We ran an exchange together in Miami. When the feds raided us for wire fraud, Sloane took the liquid assets and ran. I took the fall. I served 3 years in federal prison. She stayed legally married to me, so the government couldn't touch the money she stole. And so they couldn't force her to testify against me. Julian looked at Sloane. His eyes were wide, searching her face for a denial, for any sign that this was an elaborate, cruel prank. Sloane was violently shaking her head, but she couldn't meet his gaze. She looked at the marble floor, sobbing, the physical embodiment of guilt. Sloane, Julian whispered, his voice trembling, Is it true? Are you still married to him? She didn't answer, she couldn't. She is, Julian, I said, stepping closer to him, offering the undeniable, empirical truth. I ran the background checks through Vanguard's intelligence servers. I have the certified marriage certificate right here. If you sign a marriage license today, it is legally void. If you merge your assets with hers, as she has been pressuring you to do, she will use your capital to cover her mother's catastrophic debts, and you will be tied to an active federal financial conspiracy. Eleanor snapped, "Debs!" Eleanor screamed, her aristocratic composure completely shattering. She lunged toward me, her hands raised as if she intended to physically assault me. "How dare you speak about my finances, you insignificant little consultant? I am Eleanor Kensington. I own half the real estate in this county. You are nothing but a jealous spinster, trying to tear down your betters." I didn't flinch, I didn't step back. I looked at Eleanor Kensington with the cold, absolute detachment of a surgeon about to make a final, fatal incision. "You own nothing, Eleanor," I said. My voice was no longer soft, it was a weapon, honed over a decade of interrogations. "You are leveraged to the hilt on mezzanine debt you secured before the 2008 crash. The mortgages on this coastal estate, your Hamptons properties, and your Manhattan penthouse are all underwater. You are not looking for a son-in-law, you are looking for a 9-figure bailout to prevent foreclosure." The silence in the foyer deepened. The bridesmaids were staring at Eleanor in horror. The few guests who had crept close enough to hear the exchange were whispering frantically, pulling out their phones. "That is a lie." Eleanor sputtered, but her voice lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded thin, it sounded terrified. "It is not a lie, Eleanor," I said, checking the slim Rolex on my wrist. It was exactly 4:59 p.m., and in exactly 60 seconds, every single investor in the Kensington portfolio is going to know it. At exactly 5 p.m., the silence on the lawn was shattered by a sound that will forever haunt Eleanor Kensington's nightmares. It started as a single, sharp chime from the pocket of a prominent real estate developer seated in the second row. Then, another chime sounded from the other side of the aisle. Within 5 seconds, a cascading symphony of digital notifications erupted across the 400-person crowd. Phones were buzzing, pinging, and ringing in pockets and designer handbags. The Vanguard servers had executed the mass email drop with flawless precision. I had sent the encrypted dossier to every single guest on the RSVP list, every major financial reporter in the tri-state area, and Julian's personal legal team. The subject line of the email was simple: the Kensington insolvency and legal liabilities. Prepared by Vanguard Crisis Group, the guests began pulling out their phones. I watched as confusion morphed rapidly into absolute, unfiltered shock. The dossier was comprehensive. It contained the Nevada marriage certificate. It contained the SEC raid reports detailing Caleb's arrest and Sloane's unindicted involvement. And crucially, it contained the forensically verified ledgers of Eleanor Kensington's staggering, insurmountable debt. Eleanor's phone buzzed in the small clutch she was holding. She pulled it out, her hands shaking, and opened the email. I watched her read the first page. I watched the aristocratic, untouchable real estate magnate realize that her entire empire, her reputation, her credit, her social standing had just been incinerated in front of the most powerful people in New York high society. She dropped the phone, it clattered against the marble floor, the screen spiderwebbing into 100 jagged pieces. "You," Eleanor choked, staring at me as if I were the devil incarnate. "You sent this to everyone? You sent this to my investors?" "I am a crisis manager, Eleanor," I said, my voice smooth, even, and utterly merciless. "And when I identify a hostile entity attempting to defraud my client, I neutralize it. You attempted to isolate my brother. You attempted to uninvite me from this wedding because I didn't fit your aesthetic. You made a fatal miscalculation. You mistook my silence for weakness. You mistook my patience for compliance." I took a slow step forward, forcing Eleanor to physically retreat. "I do not belong in your circles, Eleanor, because I am the woman who destroys them. And as of 5 p.m. today, the Kensington Network no longer exists." On the lawn, the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The string quartet, realizing the wedding was irreparably destroyed, quietly began packing up their instruments. The guests' investors, socialites, and Hampton royalty were standing up, whispering frantically, turning their backs on the altar and walking briskly toward the valet stand. Nobody wanted to be associated with the family currently imploding under allegations of bigamy and federal wire fraud. It was a mass exodus. The $4 million visual narrative was evaporating into the coastal breeze. Julian had not looked at his phone, he hadn't needed to, he had heard enough. He looked at Sloane, who was still kneeling on the marble floor, sobbing into her hands, surrounded by bridesmaids, who were slowly backing away from her. Julian, Sloane wept, reaching out a trembling hand toward him. Julian, please, I love you, we can fix this, we can explain it. Julian looked down at her. The naive, hopelessly romantic boy, who had bought her a custom-cut diamond ring, was gone. He looked at her with a profound, quiet devastation that slowly hardened into absolute resolve. There is nothing to explain, Julian said, his voice cracking, but his posture straight. You are still married to a man who went to federal prison for you. You were going to let me marry you, knowing it was illegal. You were going to use my company to pay off your mother's debts. No, she screamed, the lie automatic, desperate, I love you. You love my net worth, Julian corrected softly. And you completely underestimated my sister. He reached up, unfastened the boutonniere from his tuxedo lapel, and dropped it onto the marble floor next to Eleanor's shattered phone. He didn't yell, he didn't demand the ring back, he simply turned his back on her. Julian walked over to me. He looked exhausted, heartbroken, but fundamentally safe. He looked at Caleb Vance, offering a small, grim nod of acknowledgement to the man who had suffered the fate Julian had just narrowly escaped. Are we done here, Sarah? Julian asked me, his voice quiet. We are done, Julian, I confirmed. I did not look at Sloane again. I did not look at Eleanor. They were no longer targets. They were casualties. They were the burning wreckage of a neutralized threat, and I do not waste time admiring the ashes. I turned and walked out of the heavy oak doors, leading my brother away from the altar he was never meant to reach. Caleb walked beside us, a silent sentinel who had finally balanced the scales of his own destroyed life. We walked down the crushed white gravel driveway, past the frantic valet attendants and the fleeing society guests. The coastal breeze felt clean and sharp. We reached the matte black Aston Martin. Julian got into the passenger seat. Caleb nodded to me, indicating he would call a car to take him back to the airport. Thank you, Serafina, Caleb said, his voice thick with a strange, heavy gratitude. I've waited 4 years for someone to hold her accountable. Nobody escapes the ledger forever, Caleb, I replied, shaking his hand firmly. Vanguard will handle your legal fees for the formal divorce filing. Build a good life. I got into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the powerful roar of the Aston Martin cutting through the chaos of the driveway. I put the car in gear and drove away from the Kensington coastal estate, without looking in the rearview mirror a single time. The true aftermath of a Vanguard operation is rarely televised, but it is always absolute. By Monday morning, the fallout was apocalyptic. The dossier I had distributed triggered an immediate, aggressive response from the Kensington's creditors. Recognizing the sheer scale of the insolvency, 3 major banks simultaneously called in their mezzanine loans. Eleanor Kensington's empire collapsed in exactly 72 hours. The coastal estate, the Hamptons properties, and the Manhattan penthouse were seized by the banks and immediately placed into foreclosure proceedings. The society network that Eleanor had prized above all else vanished instantly. In the world of extreme wealth, bankruptcy is a contagious disease, and no one wanted to be in the blast radius of Eleanor's financial detonation. Sloane faced a far more severe reckoning. The release of the marriage certificate and the offshore routing numbers caught the attention of the SEC regional director in New York. They reopened the investigation into the Miami cryptocurrencies exchange. Without the legal shield of a hidden marriage, which Caleb formally moved to dissolve that same week, Sloane was officially named as an unindicted co-conspirator. Her assets, including the offshore accounts she had hidden from Caleb, were frozen pending federal review. The flawless, icy blonde aesthetic was replaced by the harsh, unforgiving reality of a federal subpoena. Julian, however, thrived. The heartbreak was sharp initially, but the surgical precision of the extraction allowed him to process the betrayal without the complication of a legal divorce or financial ruin. He dove back into his work, launching a new cybersecurity firm that secured a massive defense contract within 6 months. He was sharper, more careful, and profoundly grateful. He never mentioned Sloane's name again. If there is a lesson to be extracted from the ruins of the Kensington Empire, it is a lesson about the fatal flaw of arrogance. We live in a culture that rewards the loudest voice in the room. We are conditioned to believe that power looks like expensive suits, curated social media feeds, and the aggressive exclusion of those deemed unworthy. Narcissists rely on this illusion. They build their fortresses out of intimidation and aesthetic perfection, assuming that if they look untouchable, no one will dare to test the walls. But true power does not need to announce itself. True power is not concerned with visual narratives or seating charts. True power is the quiet, meticulous documentation of reality. It is the patience to sit in the shadows while a predator exposes their throat. When someone tells you that you do not belong in their circle, do not argue with them. Do not scream. Do not attempt to force your way into a room that does not respect you. Accept the exclusion, smile politely, step back into the dark, and then audit them. Find the cracks in their foundation. Find the lies they have buried. Find the ghosts they thought they had locked away. Gather your leverage silently, methodically, with the cold, unyielding precision of a forensic investigator. And when you finally strike, do not do it to be vindictive. Do it to permanently dismantle their ability to harm anyone else. This is Serafina Sterling for Alpha Empower Stories. If you have survived the fire and learned how to build your own empire in the dark, leave a comment below. Share this video with the strong women in your life who need to be reminded that the most dangerous person in the room is always the quietest one. Until next time, stay sharp, stay quiet, and never ever lose your edge. Thank you for being part of this journey.